Hello, everybody, and welcome to a conversation with Steve Zipperstein, who is the author of Law and the Arab-Israeli Conflict. Steve Zipperstein teaches at UCLA, UC Santa Barbara, and Tel Aviv University. He's also a senior fellow at the UCLA Center for Middle East Development. Steve served as a federal prosecutor in Los Angeles during the 1980s and 1990s, handling a wide variety of cases, including the first ever federal prosecution arriving from the savings and loans crisis. Former Attorney General Janet Reno appointed Steve as her lawyer for the congressional hearings regarding the April 1993 fire at the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. Steve, I should have asked you about that when we were talking earlier. Following his government career, Steve served as the chief legal officer for Verizon Wireless and later for BlackBerry Limited. Steve will present a summary of his research regarding the early legal history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, published last year in his book entitled Law and the Arab-Israeli Conflict, The Trials of Palestine. Steve, we're thrilled to welcome you tonight to Port Jewish Center, and we're looking forward to learning from you. So I'm going to turn things straight over to you. Welcome, Steve Zipperstein.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good evening, everyone. I hope that you're doing your best to stay dry. It's unfortunately, I have to tell you, it's quite sunny and beautiful here in Santa Barbara where I live. And you're all welcome here once the pandemic is over. Let's get right to it. I'll put my slides up. I'll talk for a while and then would love to take your questions and your comments. When we think about the Arab-Israeli conflict, the law is typically not the first thing that comes to mind. Although some of you may be saying, well, the Palestinians have been using the law quite effectively in the last 20 years and so forth. But actually, the parties have been using the law and the legal process as a tool and a weapon and a resource in the conflict for the better part of the last 100 years. No more so than in 3 long forgotten courtroom trials. I've listed them here on the left that took place in the late 1920s and the 1930s, in which outside lawyers came to Jerusalem and took testimony from witnesses who were placed under oath, who were subject to cross-examination, mostly involving 2 very, very important issues at the time, and issues that still remain important in the conflict today. The first one is the controversy stirred by conflicting British promises to the Arabs and the Jews during World War I. I'll come to that in a second. And the second, of course, the conflicting rights and claims of the Muslims and the Jews to the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, the Kotel HaMaravi, and I'll talk about that as well, and then we'll come to these 3 trials. So first, let's focus on these conflicting British promises during World War I to the Arabs and the Jews. Here you see a photograph of the British ambassador to Egypt during World War I. His name was Sir Henry McMahon. And in the summer of 1915, the war was not going particularly well. Britain was bogged down in the trenches in France fighting against Germany. Turkey had become allied with Germany in the war against Britain and France. And so London instructed its ambassador here in Cairo, Sir Henry McMahon, to engage in a correspondence with the leader of the Muslims in what was then known as the Hejaz, what is today known as Saudi Arabia, the leader of the Muslims, the Sharif Hussein of Mecca. And McMahon wrote to Hussein, and they engaged in a back and forth correspondence for the next few months into early 1916, in which McMahon, basically acting on instructions from London, said, look, if the Muslims rise up, if the Arabs rise up, join with Britain and fight against Turkey, we promise you that when the war is over, we will guarantee you your independence in the Middle East. Now remember that for the last few centuries, from 1516 all the way until World War I broke out, the entire Middle East was under the control of Turkey, the Turkish Empire, otherwise known as the Ottoman Empire. And by the time we get to World War I, this man you see here, the Sharif Hussein, is the leader of most of the Arab population in the Middle East, not entirely, but most of them. By the way, the Sharif Hussein of Mecca is the great great-great-grandfather of the current king of Jordan, King Abdullah II. And so I mentioned that Turkey was in control of the Middle East. The most important thing to remember is that there was no such country as Palestine or Israel for all of those 400 years that Turkey was in charge of the region. The map on the right shows you the Turkish administrative districts for the area that we now know as Lebanon and Israel. The Turkish area was broken into a large geographic districts called vilayets, smaller subdistricts called sanjaks. And so here you see the vilayet of Beirut, comprising most of modern-day Lebanon and the northern half of Israel, the sanjak of Jerusalem, the southern part, the vilayet of Syria, encompassing all of Syria and a good chunk of western Jordan, modern-day Jordan. And so the key letter that McMahon, the ambassador in Cairo, wrote to Hussein, the Sharif Hussein in Mecca, was October 24, 1915, in which McMahon basically agrees that when the war is over, the Arabs will get their independence, except for two small exceptions, both of which have proven to be very large and important exceptions and debated about endlessly ever since 1915. First, McMahon said, France has interests in the region, and we, the British, are not free to make promises that might be detrimental to French interests. And secondly, McMahon said that certain portions of Syria lying to the west of these four towns of Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and Damascus, areas to the west, cannot be said to be purely Arab and are therefore excluded from the pledge. Later, McMahon would say that what he really meant to exclude was everything lying to the west of the vilayet of Syria, which would mean that all of modern-day Israel was excluded from the Pledge of Independence made to the Arabs. Well, 2 years and 1 month after that letter that McMahon sent to Hussein, the Foreign Secretary, the Foreign Minister of Britain, Lord Arthur Balfour, sent a letter to Lord Lionel Rothschild, one of the leading Jews in the United Kingdom. This is the famous Balfour Declaration, November 2nd, 1917. You see the original letter here on the right with the famous language, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, etc., etc. And these 67 words of the Balfour Declaration have been argued and debated about between the Arabs and the Jews ever since. The wording is ambiguous. What does a national home mean? A cultural center? A country? What does in Palestine mean? All of Palestine? Part of Palestine? And then note here as well the phrase, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. What does that mean? It doesn't say political rights of non-Jewish communities. It says civil and religious. So these ambiguities have been debated about ever since. And when World War I ended, as you all remember, the victorious Allied powers gathered in Versailles, France, to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles. They arrived there in early 1919. They signed the treaty 6 months later in June. And these two provisions of the treaty, Articles 20 and 22, have also given rise to a century's worth of debate between Arabs and Jews, the Arabs claiming that Article 20 of the Treaty of Versailles abrogated all prior inconsistent obligations or undertakings, which they claim means that Balfour Declaration of 3 years earlier was nullified or abrogated by the Covenant of the League of Nations, which comprises the first portion of the Treaty of Versailles. Well, I showed you the photograph of the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, and I mentioned that his great-great-grandchild is the current king of Jordan. That's by virtue of one of his sons, whose name was Abdullah, the grandfather of King Hussein of Jordan. Here is the other son of the Sharif Hussein. His name was Faisal. He eventually became the first king of Iraq. But here you see him in January of 1919 in Versailles, France, photographed together with Chaim Weizmann, the very, very famous leader of the Zionist executive in London, later the leader of the Jewish Agency. And Faisal and Weizmann actually signed an agreement in Versailles in January of 1919, under which Faisal accepted Zionism, accepted the Balfour Declaration, accepted Jewish aspirations in Palestine, in exchange for which, and here you see in Arabic a minor note written by Faisal, translated in English by his aide, Sir T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, in which Faisal says, yes, I accept Zionism so long as we Arabs get our independence in the rest of the Arab portions of the former Turkish Empire. And Faisal didn't stop there. He wrote a letter 2 months later in March to future U.S. Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, again expressing deepest sympathy with Zionism. And at the end of 1919, Faisal wrote yet a third letter to Sir Herbert Samuel, a very famous British Jew who was soon to become the first British ambassador to Palestine, again expressing sympathy and perfect understanding between the Arabs and the Jews. Well, what do we mean when we talk about Palestine back in 1919, 1920? We mean exactly what is shown on this map. The victorious Allied powers, after signing the Treaty of Versailles, gathered in San Remo, Italy, the following year in April of 1920 to basically divide up the areas of the Middle East that were conquered or seized from Turkey as a result of World War I. The French got Syria, the British got Iraq, and the British got Palestine. And Palestine at that time comprised not just modern day Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, but also all of modern day Jordan. Palestine was a huge geographic area back at that time. Well, I showed you the photograph of Faisal happily standing next to Chaim Weizmann, expressing sympathy for Zionism, but Faisal quickly changed his mind, and by 1921 he was arguing to the British government that in fact McMahon, the former ambassador in Egypt, had promised Palestine to his father, the Sharif Hussein of Mecca. And the British government felt compelled in 1922 to issue this white paper that you see on the left under the signature of the then colonial secretary, Winston Churchill, in which Churchill reiterated that Palestine was excluded from the pledges made to the Arabs. So that's the backdrop for the McMahon-Hussein and Balfour issue. Let's now move to the Wailing Wall issue. Here's a very famous photograph. Those of you who have been to Jerusalem, to the Old City, will recognize that we're right inside the Jaffa Gate. This is December of 1917. Sir Edmund Allenby, Allenby Street, Rehov Allenby, named after him. Edmund Allenby reading a proclamation to the gathered population of Jerusalem. And that proclamation was then incorporated into the League of Nations Mandate for Palestine, 1922, which appointed Britain as the mandatory power in charge of Palestine. And both those documents, the Allenby Proclamation and the Palestine Mandate, 5 years later, contained an extremely important legal principle known as the status quo. Essentially, the status quo meant that Britain was telling the religious groups in Jerusalem, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, that their rights and privileges at their respective holy sites would remain exactly the same under British rule as they had been for the last 4 centuries under Turkish rule. No more and no less. And Britain treated the status quo as an enforceable legal principle. Well, here you see a very rare photograph of the Wailing Wall dating back to 1857. And notice here, not the open air plaza that we're used to seeing today, but a group of stone houses that were constructed in the early 1100s. The Muslims originally conquered Jerusalem in the year 637, lost it in the Crusades, reconquered it in the early 12th century, and these homes were built under the authority of the Muslim Religious Waqf, or the Religious Charitable Trust, to house pilgrims who would come from Morocco and from other Muslim countries who would come to Jerusalem to pray at the Dome of the Rock here, at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is just off to the right. The area above here, which we call the Temple Mount or the Har Habayit, where Solomon's temple stood, is also sacred to the Muslims. Their two mosques stand there. They refer to it as the Haram al-Sharif. Our Wailing Wall, the Muslims refer to as the Burak. And so you can see how all of the religious claims of the Muslims and Jews are clashing in this very, very small area of Jerusalem. In the 1920s, the area looked more or less the same. You see the Moroccan homes here, a group of Orthodox Jews overlooking the area to the wall. Of course, this is the way it looks today. The Israelis, after the Six-Day War, cleared out the Moroccan homes and opened up the plaza. Here's another view. By the way, the Mufti of Jerusalem, the Grand Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini, lived up here. You see his window overlooking the area where the Jews would come to pray, which back in that time period was a very narrow passageway. Remember, the Moroccan homes went almost all the way up to the wall, and so the area for Jewish prayer was very, very narrow. The Mufti from his window could see the Jews as they would come to the wall to pray. The Arabs would not come here to pray. They would run their donkeys or drive their donkeys along the passageway here, disrespecting the wall, disrespecting the pavement. Here's another view, an aerial photograph from the same time period showing just how small that passageway was, that paved area was in front of the wall. This photograph from 1865 is very interesting. For one thing, no mechitza, no screen dividing the men from the women. No chairs, no benches, no nothing. The Turkish authorities did not allow the Jews to have anything at the wall other than their prayer books. No Torah, no shofar, no nothing. Look here at the front how the paving stones are coming apart. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. From time to time, though, before World War I, when the Turkish authorities were still in charge, the Jews were able to pay a little bit of bakshish and convince the Turks to allow chairs for special occasions. Here, for example, in 1910, when there was a special ceremony. Yom Kippur was always a very busy time at the wall. The Jews would flock to that very, very narrow passageway to pray at the wall. By the way, notice the Hebrew writing on the lower stones of the wall. That was removed in the 1930s. You do not see it there today. During the 1920s, there were a few times at the wall when the Muslims accused the Jews of violating the status quo by bringing chairs, bringing benches, bringing screens, blowing the shofar. The Muslims claimed that every time the Jews did that, what the Jews were really secretly trying to do was to assert ownership over the wall, effectively stealing ownership from the Muslims as a precursor to eventually rebuilding the Jewish temple on that area above the wall, which the Muslims claimed was holy to them and which would, of course, constitute a violation of the status quo. Well, this series of confrontations at the wall reached a climax on Yom Kippur 1928 when a visiting Ashkenazi rabbi from Warsaw wanted to put a mechitza, a screen, right here to divide the women from the men. The Muslims complained to the British authorities, and the local deputy district commissioner of Jerusalem, Edward Keith Roach, you see him here, decided that the Jews would be breaking the law, breaking the status quo if they brought a screen. And the next morning, he ordered the British police to forcibly remove the screen with the permission of Keith Roach's boss, the number 2 in the entire British Palestine government, Sir Harry Luke, who you see photographed here. I found Sir Harry Luke's diary in the archives at St. Antony's College in Oxford, England, a couple of years ago. And when I found the entry for September 24, 1928, Yom Kippur, lo and behold, Harry Luke wrote in his diary about the row at the Wailing Wall. A screen had to be forcibly removed, causing a scuffle. One rabbi clung so persistently, he was dragged away, removed from the area adhering to the screen. And then in a different color ink, maybe a couple of days later, Luke threw his underling, Keith Roach, under the bus, writing that Keith Roach told me nothing more would be heard about this incident, which was not true because the incident caused a firestorm in the Jewish world. There were protests to the League of Nations, protests in New York and London, around the world, and the British government felt compelled to issue another one of those white papers, this time in November 1928, a couple of months after Yom Kippur, defending the conduct of its authorities in Palestine. But the British government was still unsure of its legal position, and it asked its two top lawyers, the Solicitor General and the Attorney General of England, to issue a formal written opinion. I found this, the original typewritten version, in the British National Archives also a couple of years ago, in which the two top lawyers for the British government say that the Jews encroached on the rights of the legal owners, the Muslims, when they brought that screen to the wall, and that the Jews are only entitled to conduct their worship in the same way they did in the past. Here are the signatures from the Attorney General, Sir Thomas Inskip, and the Solicitor General at that time. He was just on his way out of office, Sir Frank Boyd Merriman. Remember his name. I'll come back to him in a minute. Well, that was early 1929 after the 1928 Yom Kippur event. And throughout the next few months of 1929, tensions mounted at the Wailing Wall, the Mufti galvanizing local Arabs around the wall as a symbol of the religious conflict between Muslims and Jews. The Mufti ordered the Muslims to disturb the Jews at the wall by either having the muezzin issue the prayer call in a very, very loud voice, or a banging of the drums, kind of a ceremony called the Zikr ceremony. A professor at the Hebrew University, Joseph Klausner, who was aligned with the Beitar, the Brit Trumpeldor movement, an acolyte of Zev Jabotinsky, a revisionist Zionist, formed the pro-Wailing Wall Committee. And by August of 1929, in the heat of the Jerusalem summer, matters came to a boil. On Tisha B'Av, our fast day commemorating the destruction of the temple, a group of Jewish youth marched to the wall, sang the Hatikvah, unfurled the blue and white Star of David flag, and gave speeches. The Mufti ordered a counter demonstration the next day, which happened to be the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad. Several Jews were murdered, and in the ensuing week, there was further violence in Jerusalem, more rioting, culminating in the horrific massacre in Hebron on August 24th, 1929. You see here a newspaper headline about rioting in Jerusalem. Here a very disturbing photograph of the rioting in Jerusalem. And then here, of course, the massacre at Hebron. The headline from the Baltimore Sun says it all, a photograph of a synagogue on the left that was sacked. And let me take you back to Harry Luke's diary. A couple of days later, the 2nd of September, Luke visited Hebron to inspect the damage, pasted into his diary this clipping from the Times of London that in horrific detail describes the savage murders of the innocent Jews in Hebron, yeshiva students, and so forth. And then I want to call your attention to this handwritten portion. In his handwriting at the bottom of the page, listen to what Harry Luke says. Many Christian houses in Jerusalem, and some Jewish ones, have painted large crosses on their outer walls. Well, when we have our Seders in a few days and we get to the 10th plague, keep in mind how terrified the Jerusalem Jews were immediately after the Hebron massacre, so terrified that they painted crosses on their outer walls to make it look as if they were Christian and not Jewish. Here you see a photograph of Mr. Luke's boss, Sir John Chancellor, who had replaced Sir Herbert Samuel as the British High Commissioner in Palestine. Chancellor was on home leave during the Hebron massacre in England. He rushed back to Palestine and on September 1st issued this proclamation in which he basically found the Arabs guilty and responsible for perpetrating the horrific massacre in Hebron. Well, the Arabs did not take kindly to this proclamation. They demanded a trial. They wanted a judicial forum in which they could air their grievances about what? About the conflicting Jewish promises of independence, conflicting British promises of independence that the British government had made to the Arabs and the Jews in the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence and the Balfour Declaration. Chaim Weizmann in London also demanded a trial because he wanted to show that the massacres were not the result of Arab grievances or the Arab state of mind, but were simply acts of terrorism perpetrated, inspired, instigated by the Mufti against the Jews. And so Sir John Chancellor, the High Commissioner, came under tremendous pressure. And a few weeks later, he confided in his diary, which I found in the library of, known as the Bodleian Library in Oxford, where they have an archive. And I found John Chancellor's diary in that archive. Look at what he says on October the 12th. I know of no one who would be a good High Commissioner of Palestine except God. And 2 weeks later, he writes the following: I am so tired and so disgusted with this country and everything connected with it that I only want to leave it as soon as can do so without failing in my duty. This is the king's highest representative in Palestine writing these words in his diary. You can imagine how much stress he was coming under. Well, the Arabs and the Jews both got their wish because the first of the three trials that I write about in my book, the Shaw Commission, 1929, was sent to Jerusalem to conduct a trial. Here you see the chair, Sir Walter Shaw, an obscure colonial judge from the British Empire, joined by three other judges and a colonial office official who went to Jerusalem, as I said, to conduct a several months long trial in late 1929. I mentioned earlier Sir Boyd Merryman, who had been the Solicitor General who co-signed the legal opinion about the Wailing Wall. Chaim Weizmann hired him to be the lawyer for the Jews, to go from England to Jerusalem to act as the barrister for the Jewish side in this trial. Weizmann paid a fortune for Boyd Merryman, 50,000 British pounds plus expenses. You can imagine how much that would be worth today. Merryman, though, did a terrible job in this trial, and I'll talk about that more in a second. Here you see a photograph of all the Palestine police officers who testified in the trial. Here is the lawyer, Ken Elmpreedy, who represented the Palestine government in the trial, and the Solicitor General, Robert Drayton. The Attorney General of Palestine, Norman Bentwich, was a Jew, and the High Commissioner banned him from working on the case because he was believed to be a Zionist sympathizer. Well, I mentioned that Boyd Merryman was out-lawyered in this trial, and here is the fellow that ran circles around him. Ioni Bey Abdul Khadi, Palestinian lawyer, brilliant, wily, crafty, clever lawyer, educated in Beirut, very urbane, spoke French fluently, Arabic, of course. And during the trial, this lawyer, Abdul Khadi, argued very successfully to the judges that the reason the Jews were trying to bring chairs and benches and screens and so forth to the Wailing Wall was because they had designs on the upper area, on the Temple Mount, where they wanted to rebuild their temple. And Ioni Bey proved his case to the judges by offering into evidence postcards like you see here, showing Hebrew writing and pictures of the Mosque of Omar, pictures of the Wailing Wall, pictures of Rachel's tomb on the way to Bethlehem, showing other scenes from the Holy Land, Mount Zion, the Mosque of Omar, again with Hebrew writing, showing that the Jews had designs on the upper area, the Haram al-Sharif, and wanted to rebuild their temple. And those of you who can read Hebrew will recognize immediately the famous words from Psalm 137, "If I forget thee, O Jerusalem." This was an exhibit in the trial, a lithograph that was made in 1926 by Moshe Mizrahi, showing the Kotel HaMaravi here at the bottom, the Wailing Wall, the Akedah, the near sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham, which took place here inside the Dome of the Rock. And so the Mufti was the star witness for Ioni Bey, and he testified about these postcards and these lithographs. He testified that the Arabs were simply defending their holy property, the wall, the Haram al-Sharif, against Jewish encroachment. And when Sir Boyd Merriman cross-examined the Mufti, you would have thought that he would have done a really, really terrific job. Here he is, the former Solicitor General, one of the most famous lawyers in England. But what does he do? He asks questions that simply allow the Mufti to continue to tell his story. And I've excerpted a couple of the questions here. This is cross-examination, folks. Cross-examination. And Merriman asks, does Your Eminence truly believe the Jews intend to take the Al-Aqsa Mosque? Yes. Does Your Eminence really believe the Jews intend to take the actual Haram? Yes. And so it's no surprise that the Shaw Commission issued a verdict that was a sweeping victory for the Arabs and a huge defeat for the Jewish side. The court found that the Arab state of mind, including the belief that the British government had double-crossed them with the Balfour Declaration, was the fundamental cause of the riots. The Mufti was exonerated for premeditation. The Jews were the immediate cause because of the demonstration they held on Tisha B'Av, and the Muslims were the owners of both the Wailing Wall and the pavement. Well, Sir Boyd Merriman lost the case, went back to the UK, hoping to become the Chief Justice, the Lord Chancellor, but the British government had other plans in store for him. They said, no, sorry, but we'll make you a judge on the local divorce court in London. A huge slap in the face of Sir Boyd. But Sir Boyd got his revenge a few years later when, in May of 1937, he signed the final divorce decree for Mrs. Wallace Simpson, enabling the recently abdicated Edward VIII to marry the love of his life. Well, let's go now to the second trial, 1930. This time, 3 judges from across Europe. Eliel Lofgren, you see here the chair of the commission from Sweden, Monsieur Bard from Switzerland on the left, Herr von Kempen from Holland on the right, went to Jerusalem and conducted a month-long trial focusing on the issue, who owns the Wailing Wall? And this time, Weizmann hired a much better choice to represent the Jewish side in the trial, Mordechai Eliash, the president of the Jewish Bar Association in Jerusalem, a very famous lawyer in Palestine at the time, later to become the first ambassador from Israel to the United Kingdom after Israel's independence in 1948. And Eliash's strategy was to show that the Jews were the ones who had been praying continuously at the wall for centuries. The Muslims never prayed there. The Muslims never viewed the wall as sacred. The Muslims never viewed the pavement as holy or sacred. In fact, you remember the photograph I showed you of the paving stones coming apart? Eliash put on a witness who testified that in the late 1870s, the Jews paid to fix those paving stones and to keep both the pavement and the wall cleansed and in good order. In his closing argument, which I've shown you here, there's only one copy of the transcript left. It resides in the archives at King's College in London. In his closing argument, Eliash made a very, very interesting, a strategic decision not to say that the Jews were the owners of the wall, but let's listen to his very, very famous words in his closing argument. He says, "I made our position perfectly clear. I have stated that the Jews have not come before the commission to claim any right of ownership to the wall itself. I have underlined it time and again that the sacredness of the wall, the very reverence with which we pronounce its name, the sanctity with which we treat it, prevent us from using the term ownership. In other words, Eliash argued that nobody owns the wall. Not the Muslims, not the Jews, no one. Well, he didn't win that point, but the Lofgren court issued a split verdict that left both sides unsatisfied. The court ruled that the Muslims owned the wall and the pavement, but then the court ruled that the wall was sacred to the Jews as well, and the pavement in front of the wall was not sacred. That was a big loss for the Muslim side. On the other hand, though, the court stuck with the British notion of the status quo, ruling that the Jews could do no more at the wall than they were allowed to do under Turkish rule, meaning no chairs, no screens, no benches. The Jews could bring prayer books on Shabbat, but not the Torah, and the Jews were banned from blowing the shofar at any time, including Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So that was the second of the three trials. And the last trial was a royal commission that the king sent in 1936, late 1936, to Palestine to conduct again a trial with witnesses, cross-examined this time by the commissioners themselves, focusing both on the wall and the conflicting British pledges during World War I and any other grievances that both parties wanted to raise. This was the so-called Peel Commission, which conducted months and months of witness testimony, more than half of which occurred in secret. There are only 3 copies of the secret transcript in existence, all 3 held at the British National Archives in London. A variety of very important witnesses testified in secret, among them Winston Churchill, Golda Meir, and Ben-Gurion, shown years later, of course, and Chaim Weizmann, by far the most important witness for the Jewish side, testified 1 time in public and 4 times in secret before the Royal Commission. Those of you who have been to Jerusalem may recognize that Weizmann is exiting his car on King David Street, the King David Hotel across the street. And on this side of the street where Weizmann is exiting is the YMCA building. You see everyone wearing coats. This was a cold January morning in Jerusalem, January 8th, 1937 to be exact. And here, testifying in secret, this was the moment when, for the very first time in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the concept of the two-state solution was raised. One of the commissioners asking Weizmann, wouldn't it be a final and peaceful settlement to terminate the mandate and split Palestine into 2 halves, one Jewish and one Arab? The same two-state solution that we're still talking about in the year 2021 was first broached in this secret session with Weizmann. Weizmann, a few weeks later, wrote a letter to Albert Einstein and said, when the commissioner asked me that question about 2 states, I was really flabbergasted. I had no idea it was coming. And in the moment, Weizmann didn't say yes, he didn't say no. His answer was, below, you see it here, permit me not to give a definite answer. Let me think about it. Well, the more he thought about it, the more Weizmann liked the idea because it was a chance for the Jews to obtain statehood. The map on the left shows you that the British were offering a very small portion of modern-day Israel, the area in green. This was going to be the Jewish state. The area in orange for the Arabs. The British were going to keep a corridor from Jaffa to Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Compare that to the map on the right, showing the 1967 boundaries, or the pre-1967 boundaries of the State of Israel. Well, the Peel Commission also in its report, which came out on July 7th, 1937, criticized Sir Henry McMahon for the fact that his October 1915 letter was not as clear as it should have been. It was ambiguous regarding whether or not Britain was excluding Palestine from the promises of independence to the Arabs. But McMahon was still alive. And a few days later, he published this letter to the editor of the Times of London, in which he said it was his duty to state definitely and emphatically that it was not intended by me in giving the pledge to King Hussein to include Palestine in the area in which Arab independence was promised. And McMahon says, I had every reason to believe that that fact, namely that Palestine was not included, was well understood by King Hussein. Okay, I'm almost done. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that, like any litigation or legal dispute, there were also some attempts by the parties to settle. And after the Hebron massacre on August 24, 1929, there were 3 such settlement attempts in quick succession in the following few days. The first one, August 26th, a very, very high-ranking Egyptian Jew, the Baron Felix de Menasse from Alexandria, Egypt, happened to be on vacation in Paris. He walked into the British Embassy in Paris, met with a mid-ranking official, not the ambassador, and offered to buy that area of Moroccan homes in front of the Wailing Wall. 3 days later, the most prominent Jewish businessman in Palestine proposed basically the same thing, except that Britain would expropriate the Moroccan homes and then sell them to the Jews. And the one I want to focus on for a minute is this last one, August 29th, 1929. Prince Mohammed Ali Pasha, the would-be future king of Egypt, is on holiday, on vacation in Istanbul. He walks in to the British embassy in Istanbul. Here you see a photograph of him. He gives his calling card. He is received by the British ambassador in the British embassy in Istanbul, and Prince Mohammed Ali Pasha hands this letter to the British ambassador saying, my proposal for a solution is that instead of fighting or dealing unjustly, it would be infinitely better to come to an understanding. And what sort of understanding was the Prince of Egypt proposing? He was proposing that the Arabs would sell the Wailing Wall to the Jews for 100,000 pounds. No one had ever heard of this. And I don't want to sound like I'm boasting, but I discovered this letter tucked away in a file in the British Archives in London about 2.5 years ago. The file was labeled Foreign Office Correspondence 1929. No one would have any reason to believe that a letter like this would be tucked into that file. I traced through the remaining files in the British National Archives and discovered that the ambassador in Istanbul, the British ambassador, sent the letter through to the Foreign Office in London, recommending against the idea that the Muslims would be willing to sell the Wailing Wall to the Jews. The letter was filed in this file in the Foreign Office with a note saying that the idea of the Jews buying the wall appears to have been long rejected, but there was never an offer by the Arabs to sell the wall. One of the Foreign Office officials made this kind of sarcastic comment in handwriting inside the file where he says, it would appear from the last paragraph of the prince's letter that while the Jerusalem Arabs would scorn to sell their honor cheap, they would probably be prepared to do so for 100,000 British pounds. And then after the letter was filed away in that correspondence file, it was contained, or it was listed in this index, the Foreign Office Index for 1929, hundreds of pages of entries like you see on this page. And the entry says, suggested sale of wall to Jews by Muslims, proposal of Prince Mohammed Ali Pasha. This was the first and only time in the entire history to this day that any Arab ever stepped forward with such a creative and interesting proposal as this proposal by the Prince of Egypt. And you might ask, what is it his business to offer to sell the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem? Well, keep in mind, Egypt at that time and even today, the most important Arab country. He was going to become king. He didn't eventually. It went to his nephew, Farouk. But at that time, he thought he would someday be the king of Egypt, the undisputed leader of the Arab world, and he had a right to make the offer to sell the wall to the Jews. Okay, I'll stop there. Here's a copy of or a photograph, I should say, of the cover of my book. I am happy to say, and I think I can see all of you. I'm happy to say that I've just heard yesterday that my next book has been accepted for publication, in which I will continue the story after 1937 all the way up through 1948, where I talk about the additional legal battles between the Arabs and Jews in Palestine during British rule. So thank you so much for your attention. Rabbi, thank you for inviting me to speak to your wonderful group, and I would love to take your questions or hear your comments.
Thank you so much. I hope you saw there was a round of applause. Are there questions? Let me just, my first question is, as a former lawyer, I remember in law school, especially when we were learning to do legal research, I remember the feeling of when you got a hit, like when you found, this is before you could look everything up on the computer, right? And we were, go through the books, and when we find that perfect case that supported whatever it is we were trying to argue. And I'm sure, and I should say, as a history major, I remember doing that too a little bit at the archives. What did it feel like when you were going through the archives and, when you found, that kind of document, the one you were just talking about, that, with the Egyptian prince or making that kind of offer for the Wailing Wall?
So I was completely stunned, completely stunned. For one thing, I immediately looked to see when did Prince Muhammad Ali Pasha die, and he lived for another 25 years after he wrote that letter, which means no one knew about this, because if it had leaked out, the Mufti would have had him assassinated immediately. The Mufti assassinated all of his political enemies. The current King Abdullah, his grandfather Abdullah I, was assassinated while praying at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in 1952 by one of the Mufti's henchmen. King Hussein's father was the victim of a contract, a hit job by the Mufti. So the prince wouldn't have survived a week if word of this had leaked out. But I didn't just trust myself based on that. I went to Israel. I met with the two top scholars of the British Mandate at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and at Tel Aviv University. And I showed them the letter, and I said, and the other documents, which I just showed all of you. And I said, have either of you ever heard about this? And the professor in Jerusalem was quite taken aback. He had just published a book about 1929 and was kind of hitting himself that I found this and he didn't. A little bit of, okay, we got past that. The professor at Tel Aviv University was extremely gracious and said to me, "You have made a major find in the history of the conflict, and I congratulate you." And this has been delayed because of COVID, but I'm going to be going to Tel Aviv University. They've invited me to a symposium on my book, and this letter will be a centerpiece of that symposium, Rabbi. By the way, I sound like I'm bragging here. I'm really a very humble person. I don't mean to be tooting my horn. I'm sorry about that.
You do not sound like you're bragging. I don't
Okay.
think, it's thrilling. I can only imagine, what it must have found like to pull that out and to read it. It's like out of a novel. It's really incredible. So no, I think all of us would agree that it's just it is a stunning find and totally and exciting.
I'll just add this. It was folded up. It was inside the envelope that the prince had given to the ambassador in Istanbul. The calling card, when I saw this envelope, which is very unusual in these Foreign Office and Colonial Office files to see an envelope inside the file. And I thought, what is this? This must, maybe some other researcher forgot an envelope that belongs to them. I better take it to the desk. And I opened it up, and out fell the prince's calling card, which I showed you. And then I unfolded the letter, and it was clear to me that no one had ever taken this out of the envelope and unfolded it. It was in mint condition, Rabbi. It was really quite stunning.
Wow, that's really incredible. Mark Marcellus, do you have a question? I'm going to turn it to you.
Yeah, I'm actually, and you've already touched upon how the Mufti would have reacted to this, but I'm just curious what your speculation is if the English government had actually said, hey, maybe this is a good idea and had moved forward with it.
Um, you know, I was going to say, and I've been asked this question many times. I was going to say, well, the Mufti would have riled up the Jerusalem Arabs. There would have been a 3-day strike, and there would have been violence, and the British would have gotten scared and backed away. But by the same token, the British had quite a lot of leverage that they didn't use at that time. Weizmann, in particular, was begging the British, all of the British high commissioners who served in Palestine and the various British prime ministers in the 20s and 30s, Weizmann was begging them to really use an iron fist to impose a solution on the Arabs. At the same time, in that third trial, the Royal Commission in 1937, when Ben Gurion testified in secret before the Royal Commission, he was asked about the Wailing Wall. Not about this letter because nobody knew about it, but he was asked about the Wailing Wall. And the question was, isn't the Wailing Wall going to prove to be a flashpoint and will make it impossible for the Jews and the Muslims to ever live side by side peacefully? And Ben Gurion said, they can have the Wailing Wall. I don't care about the Wailing Wall. I don't care about the holy sites. I want the Negev desert. That was Ben Gurion. Really quite amazing.
Wow. Any other questions? Judy Epstein?
Yes, I mean, on the one hand, my mind is boggling and I'm thinking, suppose somebody found an offer for the Louisiana Purchase similarly untaken up, or Manhattan Island for $24 in beads, it's like, or like the only thing I can compare it to, and it's not really comparable, is the Nixon administration apparently almost authorized childcare, universal childcare, which would have made so much difference. And then at the last minute, nah. So
yeah,
it is mind-boggling. So I'm still boggling, and it's an unfair question to ask you, so I will. Where do you come down at the bottom of all of this? They lied, we lied, it's ours. Where do you come down?
Okay. I'll answer that, but first I want to make sure that I mention, because I only alluded to this vaguely, the Jews had tried to buy the wall a few times since the 1870s, and the Arabs always said no. So I want to be fair. I want to be fair and clear about that. What I'm talking about is an Arab offer to sell the wall, which is the one and only time that ever happened. Okay. Now, where do I come down on all of this? Look, we were there first, but if you read Genesis, it wasn't just us, right? Who are the people that take Joseph out of the hole? I'm Rabbi, I'm straying into your territory now, but the people that retrieve Joseph from the hole in which his brothers deposit him are not Jews. They're local, indigenous, and I'm saying Jews, Israelites. We weren't Jews yet at that time, but we were there first, but we weren't the only ones who were there. And I think the fairest way to answer the question is to say that both sides have compelling claims to the land. I am a two-stater, but I'm not a J Streeter. I'm a two-state APAC person. Let me say it that way. Because I believe that the two states is in Israel's fundamental strategic interest. Let's keep the wall of separation. That's what Yitzhak Rabin wanted, separation, but statehood for both. In my second book, which I've as I said, I just got this great news yesterday. It's going to be published later this year. I make an argument that's going to be very controversial, and I'll probably be heavily criticized for this. But the argument I make in my second book is that when the United Nations offered the two-state solution, so we have the Royal Commission in 1937 offering the two-state solution. Weizmann reluctantly said, okay, it's that small green area, but we'll take it, better than nothing. The Arabs said, no, it don't belong, we get everything or nothing, all or nothing. 10 years later, in November of 1947, only 10 years later, but World War II had happened in the meantime, the United Nations again offers the two-state solution. The partition plan, November 29, 1947. The Jews say yes. And this time the area offered to the Jews was larger than that green area, not as large as the 1967 area, but larger. The Jews again say yes. The Arabs again say no. Not just no, they say hell no. And begin, at the Mufti's direction, a civil war the next day, November 30th, which then turns into an international war in May of 1948 after Israel declares independence. And so as a matter of law, if I offer you, the international community through the UN offers statehood to the Palestinians, the two-state solution, the same exact thing the Palestinians are clamoring for today, is offered to them on a silver platter in November of 1947, and the Palestinians not just reject it, but they renounce it. They renounce it. As a matter of law, that renunciation constitutes arguably a waiver. A waiver of what? A waiver of sovereignty. After 1949, when the fighting ended between Jordan and Israel, who took control of the West Bank? The Jordanians. And who kept the West Bank until 1967? The Jordanians. During all that time, 18 years, did the Palestinians take one step toward trying to declare their independence in the West Bank? Did they ever talk about the two-state solution? Did they ever say, we changed our mind, we'll take statehood? Not once. Not once. So where I come out, long answer to your question, where I come out is that the two-state solution politically is the best, strategically is the best, but as a matter of law, the Palestinian Arab claim of sovereignty to the West Bank is shaky at best. The Jewish claim is shaky. It's really uncertain at this point who owns the West Bank. So I'm going to be criticized heavily for what I just said.
Well,
I'm
good
separating
publicity.
law from politics, but I can't wait to come back and show you my scars and my wounds, maybe in a couple of years, Rabbi.
I know we'll be very interested to hear it. So I just want to thank you, Steve, so much for your time tonight. I think all of us are walking away feeling like we learned something significant.
My pleasure.
And also with a real interest in learning more by reading your book. So I want to remind everyone that it's called Law and the Arab-Israeli Conflict. And I'll send a link out tomorrow with the recording, either tomorrow or sometime soon with Passover coming up. I'm not sure the timing of it, but I'm going to send a link out with the recording of this if you'd like to send it to a friend. If you thought it was interesting and you want, and you think somebody might be interested in hearing it, please forward it. And it'll also have a link to buy Steve's book. I would also like to remind you that you can always order his book through your local independent bookstore here in Port Washington. I know that you can order it through the Dolphin, and it's always good to support our local bookstores. With that being said, I just want to say that this is the first of 3 programs that we're having about Israel. The next one is on April 21st. It's with Rabbi Yitz Novak, who is coming to us from AIPAC, and he's going to be talking about the U.S.-Israel relationship. And with everything going on in Israel, with the 4th election just having passed and still leaving us with so many question marks. If you want to know more about what's going on in Israel today, it'll be a great opportunity to ask questions and to get another perspective. The following Wednesday, we'll be talking to Ken Stern, who wrote a book called The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine Debate. And Ken will be talking about how it is that the Israel-Palestine debate is one of the most contentious on college campuses. He's going to be talking about the BDS movement, and also a great perspective for us to have. So Steve, I want to thank you for kicking this off. We have Passover in front of us, and then soon enough it'll be Yom Ha'atzmaut, and what a great way to celebrate our journey towards the promised land, beginning with you. So thank you so much. Another round of applause. I know I can see from the faces. We really, really enjoyed this. So thanks
So
so much, Steve.
Rabbi, may I thank you and all of you for joining, and I'll just end by saying Chag Pesach Sameach lekulam, Hashana Haba b'Yerushalayim.
Yes, please. Well, Hashana Haba b'Yerushalayim, but we'll even settle for Hashana Haba in person. That and then we'll pray for Jerusalem the next year. So in the meantime, we also wish you a very sweet Pesach, and yes, we pray that we will find ourselves in Jerusalem, in the land of our people very, very soon. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night, and we'll see you soon.